Well, we might have a few more folks come in, but so we can stay on schedule, I just want to welcome everyone to this very exciting Lunch and Learn with our two summer interns for EAN this year, Jennah, Slayton, and Santi. I'm going to provide a little bit of background, and then they are the main event. So I just want to first recognize that it was right after the pandemic started, we were having a senior fellows meeting with Christine and Lee and Linda and Karen Glitman. And Christine said, there are so many talented, smart, committed young folks, students whose plans have probably been turned upside down. And at the same time, we have these, pressing questions about how we can make more progress towards our energy and climate goals, research needs that they could help fill. And so Christine incredibly generously stepped forward to say, let's in the span of a week or two, create a new summer interns program for EAN, and worked really closely with Carolyn to design that, to promote it. A number of people on the call shared it. They led the selection process, and we're really lucky that they identified two phenomenally talented and smart and committed interns who are joining us today, Jennah and Tara. I also want to just say a note about how well the timing of this is all worked out. Many of you know that over the late winter and early spring, as a network, we were gathering to say, how can we improve our work as a network to be even more effective? And one of the major themes that came out of that was a desire to center equity in terms of the research and analysis that we do and how we operate as a network in terms of advancing energy equity and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And that was emerging at the time when Jennah and Tara came on with deep commitments and passions about energy equity. So we're really grateful that the research they've done helps advance that conversation in really important ways with some original new research. I also want to take a moment to thank Lisa Renstrom, who's on from Renstrom Perkowitz Social Investments. One of the reasons that we were able to do this is because we have dedicated funders who believe in the importance of leadership development, and we had the flexibility to provide a paid internship program, which we think is really important to do with internship programs, including from an equity perspective, so that we're not just doing unpaid internships. So thank you for that. But with all that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine for the remainder of the introductions, and then we'll get to the main event, Tara and Jennah's presentations. I should say, one logistical note that I forgot to mention. When Jennah and Tara are presenting, if you have a question, rather than interrupt the presentation, if you can just write your question in the chat, and then after each presentation, we'll go through the questions and I'll help moderate that. But if you want to make sure you don't lose a question, just type it into the chat, and then it'll help see how many we have and for time management. But sorry, go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jared. And I want to thank Jared and Carolyn for being willing to add this additional activity into their portfolio of activities during probably the strangest summer that any family and a group of professionals have likely ever had. And we designed this from the beginning to be an impact and outcomes focused internship. So the idea from the beginning was that each intern would identify a specific research project and a specific deliverable, and would drive their time and effort from the beginning of the internship towards whatever that planned deliverable was. In both Jennah and Tara's case, they ended up developing research-based projects that had an equity focus, and chose a pathway where the deliverable would be both a written deliverable that can be shared with the EAN network members and others interested in clean energy and climate in the future, as well as doing this lunch and learn PowerPoint-based presentation today. It's been a very fast moving program. I've never done this before. I've never worked with Jared and Carolyn in this capacity before. I've enjoyed them as a former EAN board member and senior fellow, and certainly had never met, still have never met in person, Tara and Jennah. The entire internship has been possible through the good graces of Zoom and everyone's willingness to make it work remotely. So it's been a fast moving 8 weeks. The interns had a week or two to wrap their head around who EAN is and who you as a network are and what might be of use to you, to identify and write up a program description, to get feedback from that from Jared, Carolyn, and myself, then to dive in for about 4 to 5 weeks max to actually do the work, and then a couple of weeks to synthesize what they found, write it up, go through a couple rounds of review, and be prepared for today. So with that, I want to say that we're going to start with Jennah, who has taken a look at energy burden by income in Vermont in a way that supplements, not duplicates, the infamous and very useful VEIC Justine Sears energy burden study, with which I'm very familiar because Justine used to serve on my team some of the times at VEIC when I was with them. And then we're going to move on to Tara. So Jennah's work is statewide in Vermont. And then we're going to move on after Jennah shares with you her results to Tara, who has taken a look in the Northeast Kingdom and thought about existing programs and services and barriers that can limit uptake by low-income households in energy efficiency and beneficial electrification. And so Tara's look is more specific to the Northeast Kingdom, and she's developed a portfolio of recommendations for folks to consider moving forward that could further increase low-income participation in energy efficiency and beneficial electrification. I will be advancing the slides, and I am going to pull up Tara. Oops, I got to remember to share my screen. Hold on a sec. There, that should work now. And once the electrons do their job, you should be able to see my screen. Okay, I got the go ahead from Jared, so I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to turn it over to Tara. I mean, Jennah, my apologies.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank you all so much for making time on a Friday afternoon to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about the work that I did this summer as an intern for EAN, researching energy inequity and burden in Vermont. As Jared said, please feel free to put any questions in the chat and I will respond to them and any other questions you might have at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So I want to start by introducing myself a little bit. So my name is Jennah Slayton. This fall, I'm going to be starting my remote, thanks to COVID, senior year at Dartmouth, where I study quantitative social science, which is an interdisciplinary major where I pick a social science, in my case, government and social and environmental justice, and then learn the quantitative skills such as coding and statistics and data analysis, but directly applied to my areas of passion. I'm also a double major in French studies with a focus on French opera. I first started working in the energy space when I was an intern at David Gardner & Associates in DC, where I worked on clean energy policy. And then I also do research involving the intersection of data analysis and social justice. For example, in the fall, I worked with a professor designing an experiment to determine whether there is partisan hypocrisy in the way that constituents respond to political allegations of sexual assault. And then this summer, in addition to the EAN internship, I've been working with the same professor on a paper trying to determine if Black politicians are more heavily punished for poor communication than white politicians are. So I've been incredibly grateful to EAN for giving me the opportunity to create a project so completely in tune with my interests and giving me the space to use data to further examine social inequities. Next slide, please. So I knew when I came into the internship that I wanted to do something with energy inequity or energy justice. But when brainstorming, I realized that in order to truly address these inequities properly, we have to know really what the inequities are. So I decided to do a descriptive study so that further work can be done to more specifically and effectively address energy inequities in Vermont. In order to address these questions, I used the 2013 to 2017 and the 2018 American Community Surveys from the US Census Bureau, which are weighted surveys that give estimates of the Vermont whole population. Using these surveys, I examined energy burden by income and heating fuel type by income and housing tenure. Next slide, please. The primary metric I used in my analysis was energy burden, which is the same metric that they use in the VEIC and Vermont Law School burden reports. Basically what energy burden is energy expenditure as a % of income. It's also related to fuel poverty, which is the idea that given one's income, one cannot reasonably afford their energy needs. Being fuel poor is normally defined as if energy spending is over 10% of income. Next slide, please. So I started by looking just at energy expenditure by income. So here we have expenditure of electricity, gas, and total for the year, which I calculated by adding the electricity, gas, and other reported fuel costs in the survey. So here we can see that across all types of energy, low-income households tend to purchase less energy overall. Next slide, please. However, despite spending less, these same low-income households also tend to have the highest energy burdens, which is consistent with the findings in the VEIC and Vermont Law School energy burden reports. We can see that lowest income households pay about 7 times the portion of income that the highest income households pay, putting a huge strain on their income. Next slide, please. However, the effects of energy burden are not just in the energy space. With lowest income households spending almost 1/5 of their income on energy, such high stress on their income makes it really difficult to increase wealth enough to escape fuel poverty. Such stress can also cause low-income or high-burden households to avoid large investments or investments perceived as risky that might be financially beneficial down the road. These households are also more likely to experience housing instability or homelessness. Can also have serious implications for health. High-burden households are often forced to choose between food insecurity or uncomfortable or even unsafe home temperatures. Sometimes resorting to the stove or oven for heating, which can end up being 1, unsafe, and 2, even more expensive than traditional heating measures would have been. There's also the threat of utility shutoffs, which can make heat really unreliable, which can be really dangerous in a cold state like Vermont, where heat is a matter of safety. According to the Vermont Law School report, there are more excess winter deaths, which are caused primarily by fuel poverty, than there are deaths from car crashes in Vermont. These are preventable deaths that especially harm the most burdened low-income communities. High-burden households are also much more likely to experience strokes, heart attacks, pulmonary embolism, influenza, pneumonia, arthritis, asthma, and are more likely to have their children hospitalized. They're also more likely to suffer mental health concerns such as chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. Additionally, children who grew up in high-burden households are more likely to experience these high-burden effects when they're older, making energy burden an intergenerational phenomena. Next slide, please. After looking at burden, I continued to look at fuel use. So here we can see the percentage of Vermont households in each income bracket that use each type of fuel. If there were no inequities, we would expect the percentages for each type of fuel to be around the same for each income bracket. However, this is not what we see. Instead, we find that fuel oil or low-income households disproportionately are more likely to use fuel oil and electricity, while similarly are disproportionately less likely to use utility gas and wood to heat their homes. There are a few potential explanations for this. For one, there's only one utility in Vermont that services utility gas, and the area serviced is more well off than some of the rest of the state, meaning that some lower income households simply don't have access to utility gas and also don't have access to the lower prices that come with that. Additionally, when we look at electricity, electricity is interesting because it is the least used of the selected fuel types here. However, we can also see the greatest difference in income, in use by income, with low-income households roughly 6 times more likely to be using electricity than the wealthiest households are. Unfortunately, the data that I used did not have a breakdown on how the electricity was used to heat homes, which is important because costs can vary dramatically, with electric heat pumps being more efficient, clean, and cost-effective, but the high installation costs can be a deterrent to low-income households. However, electric resistance heating has very low installation costs, but can be one of the most expensive ways to heat a home in the long run. Low-income households opting for electric resistance heating can explain part of this income trend that we see, but also has troubling implications for access to affordable clean energy. It's not just when the most burdened communities only have access to the highest costing clean energy, while the least burdened communities have access to affordable options, to more affordable options such as heat pumps. Next slide, please. Another factor that can influence fuel type used to heat homes is housing tenure, which in this case, housing tenure meaning whether or not a home is owned or rented. In this graph, we can see the percentage of Vermont households that own and rent broken down by fuel type. We see here that renters use electricity more and wood less than homeowners do. One potential explanation for some of this is split incentive. Split incentive occurs when renters are in charge of their utility bill, but landlords are responsible for energy efficiency upgrades and new heating systems. The landlords then have no incentive to put in more efficient systems with high installation costs that would save renters money down the line. This can lead to electric resistance heating in low-income housing, renting housing, because of the low installation costs, despite the increased costs for tenants. According to one study, correcting the split incentive could save low-income households in the US between $4 and $11 billion per year in total. Next slide, please. This graph is similar to the graph on the previous slide. However, in addition to tenure, I simultaneously integrated income, and then normalized the percentages. So here we can see it gives a little bit more of an accurate understanding of some of the trends that we've already been discussing. So here, for example, with electricity, we can see that renters are more likely, regardless of income, to be using electricity. However, also within renters, we also see income effects, with the lowest income households spending roughly a fifth of lowest income households using electricity to heat their homes. Conversely, when we can look at wood, which, while we saw what looked like an income trend before, with low income households being less likely to use wood to heat their homes, here we can see that home ownership is a larger factor, since homeowners are much more likely to use wood to heat their homes, and within homeowners, we don't see any income trends, implying that it is in fact housing tenure and not income that is driving those trends with wood fuel use. It's really important to look at both low income to look at both income and housing tenure when trying to determine inequity, since low-income renters have to deal with issues specific to renters and issues specific to low-income households simultaneously. Next slide, please. And then this is just a brief summary of some of the points we talked about for the graph, so that if you want to look at the graph after the presentation, you can have some takeaways. Next slide, please. So in my analysis, I did not address race due to concerns about statistical power. However, as I was doing my research for the report, it became apparent that the current best practice is to address race in addition to income, since Black low-income households have to manage energy inequity issues that low-income households in general don't. Nationally, Black Americans are more likely to live in older, less efficient homes, pay higher prices for less reliable energy. They've also been historically placed in energy sacrifice zones, and through practices of redlining and just racial resentment have suffered through disinvestment in racially segregated neighborhoods and historic and intentional barriers to home ownership, which, as we saw from the last figure, is an additional barrier to fuel accessibility. While Vermont is a predominantly white state, that doesn't mean that there aren't racial factors at play in Vermont. And so any future research examining energy inequity in Vermont should look at race in addition to income and housing tenure. Next slide, please. So poor energy systems can make economic inequity worse, but that also means that clean energy systems can help remedy economic inequity. Investing in energy efficiency, geothermal systems, heat pumps, and solar have all proven to reduce energy prices, which can help alleviate some of that energy burden. It has also been proven to create more jobs per unit of energy, reduce income inequality overall, and increase thermal comfort, health, and safety. So basically address a lot of the very same side effects of high energy burden that we've already discussed. Next slide, please. My analysis showed that the lowest income households tend to purchase the least amount of energy, but also tend to suffer the highest amount of energy burden. Additionally, I found that access to heating fuel types is not the same for everyone, with income and housing tenure greatly affecting what fuel types are a potential option for certain households. When advocating for clean energy solutions, we must ensure that low-income households don't only have access to expensive, inefficient, and at times unsafe heat, such as electric resistance heating and outdated wood stoves, while the least burdened households are retrofitted with the most recent and efficient systems. Instead of placing additional burdens on the already most burdened communities, just clean energy solutions will benefit marginalized communities and help alleviate that burden. Next slide, please. Thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great job, Jennah. Thank you so much. So if folks have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat, or just since we don't have any there to go from, just to raise your hand. Or Linda, I see one from you. Do you want to go ahead and ask it?
Sorry, getting all of my things together. So this is terrific. You did a wonderful job. And I love the different ways of cutting the information, because I think it's really important, in particular, that notion of tenure. I am curious to see if within your research, you found what particular policies might be most effective in addressing these inequities. And if you haven't done that, that's totally fine, but I'm just curious to see what you came across.
Yeah, so my research did not focus so much on policies. I wanted to just lay the groundwork so that policies could be more effective, but my understanding is that Tara will actually have some really interesting things to say about that.
Anyone else have a question? Allison, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the question was—
I need to
Jennah, if you can read that question in the chat, go ahead and just answer it.
Okay. So the question was, can you clarify the statistics about attributing more deaths to the home heating than car crashes? How were those deaths determined? So that wasn't a statistic that I created myself. That information can be found in the Vermont Law School burden report, which actually, Christine, if you go to the next slide. So it is that third source. And they have more information about how they came up with that statistic.
Ludi, would you like to pose your question? Jennah.
No, I finally found the unmute.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Ludi.
Well, I may have missed one of your comments, Jennah, because you did so much in such a short period of time. It's absolutely wonderful. But did I hear you say that addressing the issue of split incentives that is a burden, obviously, and a challenge for renters would save a great deal of money? Do you have more statistics on what kinds of savings would be accomplished by doing what? Because that's something we could address.
Right. So a lot of that simply comes from addressing split incentives gives lower income households more energy efficient systems. So because right now they end up just paying for a lot of energy, that they're not really using and they don't need to be using if they had a more efficient system. So that's where a lot of that saving comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have any references with more detail on that issue?
Yeah.
Maybe how it's addressed and how much money could be saved if it were addressed?
Yeah. So like I said, the one study that I quoted in my presentation was that nationally they can save between $4 and $11 billion, just like for low-income households in general. There's also on the selected sources slide, I have, there's one paper there on split incentives in particular, and then also in my full report, there are—
Jesse Melvin, yeah.
Yeah, there are a few additional in my full report that also discuss split incentive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And just as a point of information, I know Carolyn addressed this in the chat. Both the recording of this presentation will be available on the website, as will the reports and the sources shortly as well. But I saw that Molly had posed or raised her hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, Jennah. Great presentation, great data. I'm wondering if either you or maybe this is coming up in Tara's, I'm not quite sure, have looked at any kind of spatial information, how it relates to this. I'm thinking about like renters versus owners in more urban areas versus more outlying rural areas, and sort of how that spatial component might map on these burdens, and then also potentially on policy solutions. I'm thinking in particular about gas and that being harder, running more lines in more rural areas without the same density of customers and that sort of thing.
I think I think that's a really interesting question. I did not do any spatial analysis. I mean, I had 8 weeks to, so there's only so much that I can do, but I do think that is a really interesting question, something that should be considered further, especially with this housing tenure question.
Thanks. Ian, please feel free to pose your question.
Thanks, Jared, and thank you, Jennah, for that really great kind of overview and context setting. Having put together plenty of graphs myself, I know all the hard work that goes into producing such a short presentation, so I really appreciate everything that you synthesized and brought together here. My question is, essentially, given that you have done a survey of kind of existing energy equity information, if there were any gaps that you identified in research or any areas, you touched on this a little bit with like the example of not being able to tell where, what source electricity is generated from in terms of electrical use. I'm just wondering if there were other areas where you thought there were kind of glaring gaps in our knowledge, in the statistics, that were available, or kind of any other areas that you think are deserving of further institutional research support?
Yeah, so one thing that I suppose a few of the questions that I had when I was looking at the data, and like questions that I suppose I wished that the surveys had asked, and I would have put them in if I had been creating the surveys, is one, so we have data about, or these surveys have data about how much you're spending on energy, but they don't necessarily have a ton of information on energy prices or like the amount of energy. So you can't really see if low-income households are, or at least with the survey that I was using, you can't see if low-income households are getting, are basically paying more for the same amount of energy, which that was some data that I would have really liked to had. Additionally, as I mentioned, I think that it's really, really important to be looking at race in conjunction with income for energy inequity. And also, I think just more, again, if I were just adding questions to the surveys that I used, I would have liked a lot more specificity about how exactly, like not just fuel type, but how exactly that's being used. Yeah, as you said, so.
Thanks. It looks like we've got time for one or two more questions. Brian, please go ahead with your question.
Hey, Jennah, great job. Just wondering if you were able to talk to anyone at State Weatherization or the State Crisis Fuel Program to see if there's any areas or programs that could address some of the inequities. We've got some really robust programs, but I was wondering if you had a chance to see if there was any gaps.
I did not. As I said, I didn't focus my research on any specific policies because I just wanted to describe the lay of the land. But I think that would be a really important next step.
Great.
And Tara has some suggestions in her presentation coming up shortly, Brian.
So with that, that's a good segue. So to just keep the time moving, Christine, do you want to say anything by way of introduction before Tara begins, or should we just jump right into Tara's presentation? First, just great job, Jennah. Thank you. And thanks everyone for the questions, and we'll look forward to getting a lot of this information up on the EAN website as soon as possible.
Yes, thank you, Jennah. Great job. And Ian, Tara may have some data suggestions for you in response to the question you provided to Jennah as well. Jared, can you see Tara's?
Not, yeah, I'm still seeing Jennah's slide deck.
Hold on. Are you seeing Tara's now?
Yes.
Okay, great, good, thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tara.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Tara Santi. Thank you all again for joining today. I'm really looking forward to sharing the results of my research over the last 8 weeks with you. So similarly to Jennah, my presentation, my project also had an equity focus, and I was looking specifically in the Northeast Kingdom and looking at maybe reasons that lower income households are not able to participate in energy efficiency and beneficial electrification programs. And so just as kind of vocabulary clarification, when I talk about energy efficiency or electrification, or later I'll talk about home energy upgrades, I'm talking about installing technologies like heat pumps, as well as weatherization measures that would increase thermal efficiency in the home. Next slide, please. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I am from Golden, Colorado, which is in fact the home of NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab. So a little connection there to EAN. I just finished up a very interesting senior year at Middlebury College and graduated this May. I was a joint major in environmental studies and sociology and anthropology, and I was a French minor. I love to play ultimate frisbee, and I'm interested in regenerative agriculture and community organizing. And similarly to Jennah, I was also doing some research this summer with a professor from Middlebury, and we were looking at environmental education during the climate crisis. Next slide. To introduce my project a little bit, what I was doing in this was identifying barriers that low-income households, specifically in the Northeast Kingdom, face to being able to participate in what are really some great programs that exist for energy efficiency and electrification. And to do that, I reviewed some literature on low-income barriers and energy efficiency, nationwide studies, as well as state-specific studies. And then I also held a series of conversations with some experts in Vermont. And so some of you are here today. Thanks again for joining. I talked to people from the Vermont Natural Resources Council, from Efficiency Vermont, the Northeastern Vermont Development Association, the State Employees Credit Union, the Electric Co-op, and other organizations. And then from those conversations and the literature, I identified some common barriers and issued recommendations for next steps. I want to recognize that listening here today, we have a really great group of clean energy and climate experts. And I'm sure there are many of you who know a lot about the Northeast Kingdom because you're based there. And others of you know a lot about weatherization or clean energy. And so please feel free to supplement what I'm saying here in the Q&A. I'm definitely not going to be able to cover all of it in 15 minutes. Next slide, please. So just to set the stage a little bit, we're talking about the Northeast Kingdom, which is made up of 3 counties, Essex, Caledonia, and Orleans, and 55 townships. Next slide. And then this graphic is from the Vermont Energy Burden, as Jennah so helpfully explained earlier. And then looking at these darker orange squares that are high energy burden, we see that a lot of that is in the Northeast Kingdom. And so these are households that are spending proportionately more of their income on energy, but not necessarily using more energy. A couple quick statistics. So the population in the Northeast Kingdom is pretty rural and spread out. The median household income is lower than in Vermont total. And I just want to make sure, are my slides cut off a little bit here? I'm not sure if this is just on my end, but it seems like maybe the edges are cut off.
Bit, Tara.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's something we can fix. Christine, are you seeing the whole thing on your?
I am seeing the whole thing.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure how to address that.
Up above, you can look at your view options and you can make it be less than 100%, 50%. That works better for me.
I'm not seeing that.
No, I wasn't suggesting you change it, Christine. I was, for those of us whose view is large, we can reduce it independently on our screens.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, when I reduce my view, the slide is still cut off, but I'm guessing maybe it's the programs that you made the slides in. I don't know if you are opening it one in a different, but I think we can move forward. We can see most of it.
Yeah, I'm just worried about some things on the edges. I can also share my screen if we think that might work, but I'll try to summarize what's in the corners. Unfortunately, I'm sorry that got cut off. So on this slide, there's just another column to this table describing Vermont in general statistics. And basically the big picture here is that the Northeast Kingdom has a lower median income. And then important when we're looking at residential energy upgrades is the character of the housing. And so in the Northeast Kingdom, there is a higher percentage than in Vermont total of single family dwellings. So those are standalone homes as well as mobile homes. And I'll talk more about that later. If you can, Christine, advance to the next slide. Well, you can see most of that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about barriers for the next few slides. And
Sarah, if you're more comfortable, feel free to just share your screen so we can see the full slide. It'll only take a minute.
Okay, yeah, maybe let's do that. Let me get my...
I'll stop share. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure why I encountered that with your deck and not with Jennah's. So I'm going to stop share, Tara, and you share your screen and see if that helps.
Okay. Give me 1 minute to get this set up.
Yay, working through COVID times, everyone. Go adaptability.
It sounds like I'm not the only one that doesn't know how to solve it from my end. So that's reassuring.
We're all getting better at this stuff by leaps and bounds, by necessity, every single day, Christy.
Yeah. And Teams and Zoom aren't exactly the same either, and I'm back and forth between the two, as many of us are.
I also just take this moment to say that if you want to go into the participants and rename yourself so that folks can see not just your name, but your organizational affiliation, that's helpful in the questions and answers for reference.
And that display is working a lot better, Tara.
Okay, excellent. All right, so we'll do it this way. And I'm going to be looking on my notes on the side here. So starting with the barriers here. So these are barriers that have already been addressed, but they're things that came up repeatedly in the interviews that I had over the course of this internship. And I think merit continued attention and focus, especially in the Northeast Kingdom. So starting with upfront cost, as Justine Sears is saying here, this is a really important barrier for lower income folks. And there are great programs in Vermont that provide awesome discounts and rebates and tax credits for various energy efficient technologies and weatherization. But for some low income households, that is still not enough. And they simply lack the liquid money to be able to pay that upfront cost. And in addition, traditional financing might not work for them. Transaction costs, these are non-monetary costs and things that might prevent people from making what otherwise would seem to be a very smart economic decision. So for instance, it can be simply too time consuming or difficult or confusing to research all the programs that are available, how to apply to them, and then to apply to them. And people might say, it's just not worth my time. And I do want to point out here that NeighborWorks of Western Vermont's Heat Squad is doing a really great job in Rutland, and then now has expanded into the Northeast Kingdom of making the process of weatherization as streamlined as possible and really helping people through every step of that. A disruption, so people might not want to endure a construction team in their house for days or weeks. And then finally, simply not knowing the programs that are out there or ways that they can reduce their energy consumption. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm so used to saying that I forgot that I'm advancing them. So psychological barriers. These are mostly from the literature, but do apply to low-income households. And so inattention, that is the failure to notice something that might be fully visible because your attention is focused elsewhere. So for low-income households, attention can be on a number of other very pressing issues and not necessarily on home energy first. And that's what Lori Fielder is saying in this quote at the bottom, that people do have competing priorities and home energy is just one among many. Bounded rationality, similarly, is when people make satisfactory decisions rather than optimal decisions. So if we think about someone who is limited by income and time and mental energy, they may settle for an easier solution now than the optimal long-term solution. And then finally, some people have distrust of free government programs or may not have the best relationship with the utility if they've experienced disconnections and shutoffs in the past due to late payments on those electric bills or energy bills. And I'll come back to this later, but this is one really important reason to continue to work with local community groups that have established relationships and trust in communities. So moving on to workforce, this is a problem across many sectors in Vermont, but it did come up in nearly every interview that I had concerning contractors and a lack of contractors to actually do the weatherization or installations that need to happen. And contractors are not just important because of the physical work they do, but as Lori Fielder is saying in this blue quote here, that they provide this crucial link to the actual households, and they're the people who are on the ground getting the information out and letting people know what's available to them. These last two I'll touch on briefly. So data limitations, this is kind of in line with what Ian's question was for Jennah. The Northeast Kingdom is a pretty small area, and there is data, especially from the Northeastern Vermont Development Association, NVDA, on demographic and geographic information, but this is a region that could really benefit from future study, and especially thinking about a study similar to Jennah's, linking fuel type and income quintile, but with a more geographic focus to really understand the needs and the issues for low-income folks in this area. And then finally, funding. This is for the programs themselves. There is no set steady source of funding for thermal efficiency in Vermont. So there is the Vermont energy efficiency surcharge on electric bills, but that funding is actually dedicated to electric efficiency, and so may not cover all of these thermal efficiency measures. And this was previously funded through RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, but those funds are declining, so that could also be an area of focus in the future. So continuing on, the Northeast Kingdom is a rural area, and that poses a challenge in multiple areas. So first of all, thinking about people who are heating their homes not through a utility. So this could be through an energy service provider that gives delivered fuels like propane or kerosene. This could also be people who heat their home with wood, cordwood that is cut from their own property. And this is a barrier because utilities or sometimes energy service providers are the ones providing information about energy efficiency programs. And so people who are not as connected with those utilities may not be getting the same information and know-how as those who are. And then as far as barriers for programs themselves, when we think about how rural the Northeast Kingdom is, the houses are really spread out. It's simply less cost effective for utilities to drive those longer distances, both for outreach and then also for implementation and installation. And related to that is this lack of broadband, which limits the types of outreach that can happen. So for instance, web-based outreach, as well as the types of technologies that can be installed in homes. So something like a smart thermostat that might need internet access. So physical home attributes, as I was mentioning before, it's really important to look at the characteristics of the housing in question. That would be getting weatherized or having new technologies put in. And so looking at this graphic, we see that in Vermont, or in the Northeast Kingdom, there's a higher percentage of standalone single family dwellings. And these are on larger lot sizes. So again, related to how rural the area is, it's more expensive to electrify this area than it would be in a dense region. The homes in the Northeast Kingdom are also tend to be older, often built before 1940. And so that is related to kind of leaking issues. They're more expensive to heat, as well as more expensive to do energy retrofits on. So things like weatherization are more complicated. And then something like an energy audit going into the home can uncover health and safety issues related to the age of the house that might need to be addressed before retrofits can happen. And so that can dissuade homeowners as well as landlords from even doing energy audits because they're worried about those costs adding up. And finally, looking at this graphic again, we see that there's a higher percentage of mobile homes in the Northeast Kingdom, which is a barrier because mobile homes are often heated by delivered fuels like propane or kerosene, and they also have a much more limited energy retrofit potential than established housing. The last barrier that I'll touch on is about town energy committees. And so we look at this map and it's pretty clear that there are fewer town energy committees in the Northeast Kingdom. Obviously, there are fewer people and fewer towns as well. But looking at this quote by Joanna Miller, we see just what a crucial role they play in outreach and program implementation. They're seen as a very trusted and reliable source in the community. And there's great work being done by VNRC as well as NVDA to build those groups and expand their capacity. But most of the work right now is, excuse me, a lot of the work right now is being done more on the regional level. So to launch in a little bit to my recommendations, basically considering all of these barriers, I came up with a series of recommendations. And for the most part, these are expanding on great work that is already being done. But I hope that they are addressing some of these barriers that are definitely ongoing in the area. So the first recommendation is to create an advisory committee specific to the Northeast Kingdom with a variety of stakeholders. And this would help low-income households as well as local partners have even more of a voice in the process of creating and rolling out programs to know, to create a feedback link to kind of know what's working for people and what needs still need to be met. And to continue to build trust and cooperation in communities. My second recommendation addresses a few important barriers. I'm suggesting kind of having collaborative programs with more coordinated delivery of many services. So thinking about programs that deliver services not just for energy efficiency, but maybe also for health, for water efficiency, for air quality, for financing, et cetera. In the hopes that this is going to reduce the number and severity of disruptions in a household and increase access by making programs simpler. So instead of having to look and research 10 different programs to address 10 different problems in the house, somebody might get more of their needs met with one program. And I want to draw on a recent report put out a couple years ago by the Vermont Department of Health on the benefits of home weatherization for health, showing that weatherization interventions can improve respiratory and mental health, and that those improvements are actually greater in low-income households. So that's just one example of how aligning the goals of multiple programs can provide even more benefits for low-income households. This third recommendation is addressing some informational barriers, and I'm suggesting a targeted outreach program in the Northeast Kingdom, specifically to partner even more with local community groups. So not necessarily just town energy committees, but also contractors and other community and faith-based organizations, the community action partnerships, the capstone action agencies. And this is a tactic taken similar to vital communities in the Upper Valley region in Vermont and New Hampshire. And they recognize that putting a geographic limit on outreach campaigns can help normalize a change within a community because it's more visible and more present. And so if you have a neighbor whose home has been weatherized, then you're more likely to also think about doing that yourself. So these fourth and fifth recommendations both concern financing. And so the first one is to continue to find ways to help low-income households finance projects. And so a lot of this work would actually be expanding on via CCU, the state employee credit unions, V-Green loans and home energy loans that are in partnership with Efficiency Vermont. These are both great options for lower income households to finance, as well as analyzing some data from an upcoming pilot program that Efficiency Vermont is going to do with an on-bill investment in the Northeast Kingdom. And so on-bill lending is a great option for households that might not be able to pay an upfront cost for technology because the utility is going to install the technology and pay that upfront cost, and then it's paid back monthly through the bill as the person is already saving money. This fifth recommendation is just continuing to draw on the benefits of partnering with multiple areas and sectors. So I mentioned health before, the health world, and there was actually a recent report from the ACEEE, the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, that came out this month, I believe, that was about how to leverage health funding for energy efficiency projects. And so that is going to be a great partnership going forward and is already going on with Efficiency Vermont and NeighborWorks of Western Vermont. And so in general, this will hopefully increase funding for low-income households. My final recommendation here is commonly recognized, but should be said, that it is enormously helpful to have a steady source of funding for thermal efficiency. This is something that was mentioned a lot in the interviews that I conducted, just to help out those folks who might not be able to pay the full cost of energy efficiency or electrification upgrades. So those are all of my recommendations. Here are some of my sources. I want to take a moment again to thank all of the people who I spoke to through the course of this project for their time. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. I think Jared is going to be moderating again, and I'll leave my contact info up there in case you'd like to reach out to me afterwards with questions or comments. And thank you all again for your time.
Great job, Tara. So any comments or questions that folks want to share with Tara?
I just have one comment, and I look forward to organizing a regional effort in the Northeast Kingdom. I wholeheartedly agree with the recommendations, and I think it's something that should be done. One thing that we have talked about doing is developing some kind of regional or sub-regional energy committee. And I think that entity could take on many of the functions that you're talking about. Because it is a challenge establishing active energy committees at the local level. We have a few that are operating informally, but there's only so much they can do. And in very rural communities, it's hard to find volunteers to take on those activities.
Yes, and I think especially with those lower income folks that might not have as much volunteer time to offer to an energy committee. Yeah, and I'll hope to send my report to you, Allison, just because I do have a couple more specific suggestions for things that a regional area focus could look at in the Northeast Kingdom.
Great, thank you.
Just note for folks who may not have seen, that question was from Allison Lowe with Northeastern Vermont Development Association. Thanks, Allison, and VDA. Sue, looks like, oh, sorry, you have to go, but thank you for joining us. Linda, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I had two questions. One is, would you think that Efficiency Vermont, that it might be useful for them to have a very targeted regional approach to their work, especially if they're going to be, we hope, turning into more of an all fuels efficiency utility? That's one question. And then the second is, I just wondered if either of you had looked at transportation specifically, or was this entirely thermal for both of your reports?
Yeah, great questions. I'll address the second one first. I don't think either of us addressed the transportation. I think that is definitely an avenue to go down, but I think we both recognize that that in itself is a project to take on. As far as the first question, I definitely think that it would be great for Efficiency Vermont to develop a regional focus, but I do understand that because it's a lower population in rural area, it's harder to tackle. And so I think I would be more inclined to have NVDA be kind of taking the lead on that, as well as I know VNRC is in charge of a lot of outreach and educational programs. And so that is also a great focus. But I think the point in focusing on the Northeast Kingdom is kind of to show the benefit of using an equity lens. And so looking at an area that might have less total energy savings because there are fewer people, but would create some really big changes in people's lives.
Thank you. And then one last thing that just comes up as I'm thinking about your recommendations. You're talking about a sustainable funding source. One of the ways that we obviously have funded Efficiency Vermont is through RGGI, and we're moving slowly to TCI. But I would just say that this also begs the need to include the thermal sector in a cap and invest approach, which seems to have just fallen through the cracks. And for New England, thermal is really a big deal. So just throw that out there.
Yeah, thank you. And again, another great reason to look at total energy rather than just electrical efficiency or transportation.
Great. I know that some folks have probably scheduled until 1, so we've got time for one more question. And then for folks who are able to stay on a little bit longer, we can take the additional questions. But let's go, Brian, if you want to pose your question.
If it's okay, Jared, I'm going to defer to Roger. I think that's more, his question's more relevant.
Okay. Roger, please go ahead. Thanks, Brian.
So this relates, I think, both to Tara's and Jennah's presentations, which is that from my perspective as a utility governance person, I see that the electricity efficiency charge is paid more by low-income people who are using a larger proportion of electricity, but they get relatively less benefit than other economic sectors that are more in a position to take advantage of that. And I could make a similar comment about net metering, which is that tends to be utilized by people who are in higher income groups and who are more aware of the economic benefits of taking advantage of net metering subsidies. But because that raises electricity rates for all utility consumers, low-income people may end up paying disproportionately. Is that something that's on your radar, and do you have any thoughts about dealing with it?
Wow, a great question. I'm certainly not going to be able to address all aspects of that. Originally, this project was looking at, I did research some ways to reduce electric bills for lower income folks and various programs that have worked in other states, but didn't end up including those in the final project because I was more interested kind of in the thermal efficiency and in new installations of technologies. As far as net metering, I think an interesting aspect of kind of how this project came about that I didn't mention was that we were originally focusing on the Northeast Kingdom because of looking at that excess wind generation that's created with the Sheffield Highgate export interface and kind of considering ways that we might actually increase electrical consumption in that area because it is existing and is not being used to full capacity. So as far as net metering there, I'm not sure. I'm obviously not completely versed in all of the possibilities in the Northeast Kingdom, but I think that is definitely a question to consider going forward with lower income households facing that energy burden.
Thanks, Tara. So for folks who do need to get off at the hour, I just want to say just a huge thank you on behalf of Christine and Carolyn and I who talked about this yesterday and the whole network. Just so proud of your work, impressed by the quality of it, and thankful that you shared it. It's going to be so valuable to ongoing network conversations, and I think network members will really see it utilized in multiple ways going forward, including our summit upcoming in October and some other ways. And so look for it on the website. Thank you again for the presentations, for sharing your contact information. I do see a couple more questions have come up. So for folks who are able to stay on, we can take those. But for everyone else who had scheduled it otherwise, feel free to drop off without any judgment. But just wanted to make sure to offer that thank you before folks left. So Ian, it looks like your question is next.
Thanks, Jared, and thank you, Tara, for this great research. I'm wondering if, in addition to the Heat Squad example you shared of like ongoing efforts that are already kind of effective, if you heard over the course of your interviews any other stories of kind of existing work that seems to be working, or if not, just kind of what particular tactics seem effective in the absence of kind of further resources, which I think we all know is incredibly important and would really move things to the next level, but always challenging to find. And I really, in the absence of, federal action on the COVID situation, I really wondered and worry deeply about what kind of state level funding and capacity will be as states and institutions wrestle with the economic impacts of COVID.
Yeah, definitely. Excellent question. I think I can't speak to necessarily the state level response, but I would point you in the direction of Vital Communities in the Upper Valley region. I talked to Sarah Brock there, and they do, so I mentioned that in the context of having a geographic limit on outreach campaigns, and they've had some success in kind of their structure and process of reaching out to towns and gathering volunteers around a very specific cause, whether that's solarizing or weatherizing or developing a more robust local food system. And so they have a great process there that they've developed.
Great. Well, I think since Linda has left, she's not here to answer that question. Is there anything else, Christine, Tara, or Jennah, that you want to say by way of closing?
Hey, Jared, I can come back to mine now.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Brian.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. I was happy to yield to Roger. That was a great question. So thank you, Tara. Great presentation. There's been a very vibrant and ongoing discussion about the use of home energy scorecards and efforts to link a home energy upgrade to the time of a home sale when there's money available. My understanding of that process, which I am not directly involved in, is it's kind of been in fits and starts. Did you have a look at that? And do you think that it provides opportunities, particularly in lower income communities or for lower income households, or would actually work as a disincentive or a barrier to upgrades or something in between?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Brian. That is not something that I looked at specifically. I think that one of the problems that goes on here is that there is a lack of data with home energy scorecards. I obviously don't know everything, but I know that it's hard to find more specific data on and for how individual households are doing. And I think in general, just related again to the whole home ownership program, that is a possibility for future work in the Northeast Kingdom, seeing as I didn't talk about this as much, but there's a higher rate of home ownership in the Northeast Kingdom, which is not necessarily a sign of greater income, but rather a lack of other types of affordable housing. So, you know, I think it could go either ways. Either way that is a good time that would limit disruption, but at the same time, there might be less income available to people who are moving households, and additionally, those households may be handed down through generations rather than sold off as much.
Well, with that, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us, for the great job with your presentations, Jennah and Tara. And we will get this up on the EAN website, as both the video and the presentations and the papers as soon as we can. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and just please give a round of applause and celebration for such a successful round of summer internships and this wonderful research that's been produced. Thank you, Tara and Jennah. You can unmute for that. That it'll be even, you know, we can have the real cop, or we can just, you know, see the clapping hands in the corners of the icons of videos.
Thank you both. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you all.
Excellent, excellent spent hour.